Both players here are 2-0. Whomever wins advances on to the round of 16 is the first player to do so today. Our first competitor, considered one of the greatest players of all time from France. Let's welcome Gabriel Nassif Yellowhat, who, as you might imagine, is literally wearing the yellow hat. It's so beautiful. We'll be running Esper Acuity, not necessarily the same Esper control list many of the competitors are bringing one, but only 9 of the competitors brought here today, as well as Teamer Reclamation. Gabriel's opponent, 3rd place at Pro Tour Ixalan in 2017, one of the MPL pros from the USA, it's John Rolf. John, I'm very pleased to say, is running Cruel Warriors, which is my favorite deck ever. I will be biased in your favor this match, John. Also, we'll be running Esper Control. Gentlemen, shake hands, head to your booths, and let's head over to David and Marshall for the match.
Players are getting seated. They're going to be getting set up on the computers here, but we're going to get a chance to take a look at what lists they're running in the meantime while they kind of get everything set up over there.
Gabriel Nassif's configuration is not very common. You know, you see a lot of the pro players here with an Esper control deck and then one of the aggro decks, white or red. He kind of opted for his own take on Esper Acuity, and this deck, Teamer Reclamation, which I believe we saw once early in the broadcast yesterday. It didn't fare too well. Its weaknesses are usually the quick aggro decks that can get under it before it can set up and develop, but luckily for him, John Rolf didn't bring one of those.
That's
so
right.
It actually bodes well for him.
This could be really good. Late game on this deck is absolutely absurd as well, with Niv Mizzet, Perun, and the copies of Expansion Explosion with all the mana that you can make thanks to Wilderness Reclamation. So, yeah, we could definitely see this looking good for our old friend Yellowhat here, or Yellowhat as you call him.
This deck excels against Esper Control, so he's really hoping that this matchup gets paired against Esper Control. The Cruel Warriors deck, although it's not as fast as the aggro creature decks, as you see, he doesn't have a lot of ways to remove big creatures from the board. Shivan Fire he has to kick. Expansion Explosion, he has to have a lot of mana, so he probably has to have Wilderness Reclamation with it to get something like, say, a 4/4 off the board. He doesn't have very many options, and John Rolf's Warrior deck does put a lot of those out there.
So here's his Esper Acuity deck, and you know, we actually haven't seen that many of these. We've seen Esper a lot of times, but this particular build has Dovin's Acuity as a focal point.
Yeah, it seems like he's not playing it doesn't seem like he's not playing Teferi and instead playing Dovin's Acuity. It's a little cheaper, gets you a card, has a lot of combos with all the instants in the deck. So it's gonna, we'll see what wins, that or Teferi. I mean, I'm a big fan of Teferi, but I understand why. It allows him to run things like the Immortal Sun in his sideboard with Mastermind's Acquisition, which is a really powerful card.
Yeah, potentially shores up the red matchup. This is actually the red deck that John Rolf has chosen here for this tournament. He's actually very well known for playing mono-red strategies. In fact, he loves them, he excels at them, but he's decided to veer off a little bit and go not quite mono-red here, David.
Yeah, this deck is, like I say, it's not the same. It doesn't try to go wide and put a lot of creatures on the board like the white deck or try to burn you out like the red deck. It does have the 8 burn spells, but you're not looking to really burn your opponent out. You want to use that maybe to finish them off after you get some big creatures out. Creatures are pretty large, and they're all the kind where you can just put one on the board and make your opponent deal with it. So I imagine we'll see a strategy like that against Nassif's 2 control decks.
That's right. Now on the other side, it is a control deck in the hands of John Rolf. This is a more traditional build of Esper Control. I see the 4 copies of Teferi, Hero of Dominaria in the middle of the screen there.
Yeah, and unfortunately for John, this deck doesn't match up well against either of Nassif's 2 decks. All the things like Cry the Carnarium, Moment of Craving, even Vraska's Contempt, since Nassif's not playing Planeswalkers, they're pretty much dead. I mean, you can maybe get a Niv Mizzet, but if a Niv Mizzet is out against your Esper Control deck, you're not doing so great. So I don't think this deck is well positioned against Nassif, so hopefully Nassif, and his sake, gets the matchup he likes, and I don't think it'll be too tough for him.
Yeah, Nassif also known for playing control decks as well, so playing a control mirror against Gabriel Nassif, not a super fun thing to be on the other side of. Let's take a look here at our opening hands.
So yeah, this is Nassif's opening hand. He's on the play. It's a very solid hand. I mean, obviously you don't want Nezahal in your opening hand, but if you are against the Esper Control deck, that's a huge haymaker. But he does have 4 mana, a good mix, some basic land types, so his lands will come into play untapped afterwards. And Thought Erasure, which is a great turn 2.
And check this out, it is not the Esper Mirror here. John Rolf has drawn his Cruel Warriors deck for game number 1. These decks, as we mentioned throughout the course of the weekend, are chosen at random here for game number 1. They'll be playing their other deck in game number 2. And then they'll get to choose which one they want for game number 3 if we get to that point. How's this opener look, Dave?
This opener's all right. I mean, you've got 2 mana. You can cast your warriors, you know, Thorn Lieutenant on turn 2. You still need some more mana to get to Chain Whirler. So it's okay. I don't think you can ship it back, especially being on the draw. But, I mean, again, what else are you looking for when you play kind of a mid-range creature deck like this? Unfortunately for John, I think Nassif got the perfect scenario in all instances. He got the matchup he wants for now. That'll make the matchup next turn even better with the Reclamation deck against the Esper deck. And Nassif's on the play now with his Esper Control deck.
Goodness.
And then he gets to be on the draw on the Control Mirror, which is actually okay because sometimes that extra card is all you need. You're not going to be under early pressure. So it's all coming up Nassif right here.
Wow, things looking good for the Hall of Famer, the 9-time MC Top 8er here. And by the way, you can get a little glimpse sitting next to him is the yellow hat. And by the way, so that's the impetus for his nickname. It's also the one. Like, that's the yellow hat that he wore to the Pro Tour so many years ago that kind of people said, who's that guy with the yellow hat? And he started winning everything.
It was in, I believe, September of 2001. It was in Pro Tour New York, Team Pro Tour. I remember seeing him in the feature match area or maybe in the top 4, and I'm like, who is this kid I've never seen with this goofy hat on?
Yeah.
And now he's one of my best friends on the Pro Tour.
Yep. He's also one of the most successful players in the history of professional Magic. So we are underway here. This is a decider, by the way. The winner of this will advance through the pod and be one of the 4 players to get out of it.
Collision Colossus, the first draw for John. Not really the card you want here. There's no flyers to kill. I mean, it is just kind of a weirdly costed giant growth. So it's almost like 2 mana for 4 damage, but you can get kind of blown out if your creature gets killed in response. Thought erasure here.
Yeah, taking his time here as he is wont to do.
I mean, I think we're going to take the 2-drop here, the Thorn Lieutenant. It leaves John needing to draw mana to play anything other than Dire Fleet Daredevil, and Dire Fleet Daredevil's strength is usually with extra mana, so you can kind of use that ability to maybe flash back a Mastermind's Acquisition, which is why John submitted a sideboard.
Lightning Strike off the top of the library, and here's a decision point now for John. Usually you name Warrior with that unclaimed territory that would unlock the ability to cast, not the Dire Fleet Daredevil, unfortunately for him.
But he's got a mountain, so he can cast the Dire Fleet Daredevil with no problem.
Yep. Is that what he's going to do? Do you just get something on the board here?
You know,
no, you do not.
It's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you want to play it, but you want to get some value out of it later. Is a 2-1 really going to do what you needed to do right here against a likely hand of removal? Turns out it actually would have been fine if you look at Nassif's hand, and he maybe could even cast those Collision Colossus on it and get some damage through.
Now he's going to go upstairs with a Lightning Strike on end step here, and there's a Growth Chamber Guardian off the top. That is also a Warrior, so he will be able to cast it. And this could be a problem for Nassif without an answer, but he's got the Absorb at the ready, so he'll say bye-bye to that, go back up to 20 life.
Yeah, it would be nice right
much
now to have a source of damage out, have Dire Fleet Daredevil picking away at Nassif's life total. But again, I think John wants to get some more advantage out of it, maybe cast a Chemist's Insight late game or even a Mastermind's Acquisition.
John's going to show some patience here.
Not drawing lands is really awful, though, because one of the ways you beat these control decks is you have to apply continual pressure, and he's just not applying any, allowing Nassif to do things like if he wants this turn, he can just cast a Mastermind's Acquisition on turn 4 in his main phase. And what's the worst that could happen? Not much.
Not really much, and that's exactly what he's going to do. So this is going to set up Gabriel for the next turns. Let's see what he grabs with it.
He's got a lot of interesting options. I mean, he could just go for the throat and get something like a Lyra Dawnbringer right now, so that if he draws a land, he can just have pressure to win the game. But then he did see the Collision Colossus is in his opponent's hand, so he doesn't know that likely gets trumped.
This is like going to your favorite restaurant. He's just flipping through the menu, deciding which beautiful thing he'd like to order up.
Looks like he selected Profane Procession.
That is very difficult for any deck playing a forest to beat. He's going to be able to start taking out creatures on the other side of the battlefield, and they'll start appearing over on Gabriel's side of the battlefield there.
Yeah, he knows John's list doesn't have any enchantment kill on it, so there's not much John can do about it. So getting to just exile creatures for 5 mana and not spending any more cards is pretty amazing. And once it flips, the creatures you put back are going to be large. There's even putting back a Dire Fleet Daredevil. You can kind of flash it back and maybe
get a little value.
Get a little value, although the most value you can get is a Lightning Strike.
Or Collision Colossus. That would be rude, right?
Wait, put the Spellbaker back in play, and then the following turn in combat, put the Dire Fleet Daredevil in play to flashback a Collision Colossus and do 8.
Oh, goodness. The wheels are turning now for David Williams here. He's seeing the value, and I'm sure that Nassif is thinking a lot of the same things. Now, finally a third land here for John. And he gets 5 power on the battlefield and starts chipping away at that life total. But with all the time that Nassif has had, it feels like it's going to be very difficult for Rolf to come back. Profane Procession, well, let's get that rolling.
In the main phase, due to the hexproof on John's turn ability by Gruul Spellbreaker. Look, another Gruul Spellbreaker, though. 5 more damage coming in if he chooses to give it haste.
Yeah, that is the one thing about Profane Procession. It is slow. That took the entire turn there for Nassif. Now he's going to take 5 damage here, go down to 11 life. But still, the Procession, very real in situations like this.
Yeah, Nassif really wanted a 7th mana here so that he could cast, so he could activate the Procession and still leave 2 mana up for Moment of Craving, and then take out the Daredevil and leave 0 power on the board. Because as it stands, you know, if he removes the Spellbreaker, he's still taking at least 2 from the Daredevil, and if a Forest comes off the top, he could take 6 and lose over half his life.
Yeah, that would have probably sealed it up if he hit a land there.
You could also just play Nezahal, 7/7s. Pretty hard to deal with this board. I mean, I guess you could cast Collision Colossus and kind of trade your creatures, but then Nassif also would get to draw a card by you playing that and could theoretically remove his Nezahal by discarding 3 cards. Spellbreaker does have Trample, though, so you would get the damage through.
All right, down to 9 here for Nassif.
We're going to see a Goblin Chain Whirler.
Yeah, that's right. And there it is. Goblin Chain Whirler goes on the stack. Now, the effect doesn't really have much on the board, but it does knock Nassif 1 life point lower.
Thing is, if Nassif exiles it with Profane Procession, when he does put it back into play, that 1 damage can kill the Direfleet Daredevil. So,
yeah, that's what Profane Procession does. It turns your creatures against you. It just takes a little while to do so. But I mean, imagine the incredible value, right, that Nassif is able to get just from this 1 card that he searched up. He finds a Watery Grave as well.
Yeah, now Nassif can play his Watery Grave and go to 6. The Moment of Craving will put him back up to 8, which I think he's going to do. Oh, wait, he actually had a land because it flipped. The Profane Procession flipped and wasn't tapped.
That's right.
So he stays at 10.
Beautiful turn there for Gabriel Nassif, and he is definitely in the driver's seat at this point. A Growth Chamber Guardian hits the battlefield now for John, but I think we can expect to see that get Moment of Craving away before he even has a chance to pay for the Adapt on it.
Yeah, and he's got to feel good about drawing a Revitalize, because one of the ways he could lose this game is being burned out or have those Collision Colossuses give a creature a bonus if it does live, but Revitalize can help get his life total out of reach. Just going to go for Nezahal.
All right, so he's going to go for Nezahal, Primal Tide.
Well, he knows his opponent's. He knows 3 of his opponent's cards. So if his opponent wants to cast Collision Colossus, Growth Chamber Guardian is not big enough to get through it.
That's right. He also would need a Forest to do so off the top of the library. There's another Chain Whirler hitting the battlefield, but unfortunately no attacks here for John Rolf. He just has to pass a turn back, and things really starting to slip away from John, even though he does have Nassif down to 9.
Yeah, and even though the Unclaimed Territory can make green to cast the Growth Chamber Guardian, it doesn't make green so that you can activate the ability to search up more. So Nassif was basically not worried about it, and if his opponent drew a Forest, then so be it. Got a few options here. He could pass and activate the flipped Profane Procession. I don't know the name of the flipped version. It's what's the name of that place? Glen Rose, I think. Alendra.
You put yourself in this corner, buddy. Don't look at me.
It's not something you see flipped very often in Constructed.
Yeah, that card has seen fringe play at best.
But here it's pretty backbreaking.
Powerhouse Unlimited, though.
Searching his library this time.
There it is. Tomb of the Dusk Rose, buddy.
The Dusk Rose. I was searching his library for the card, not the sideboard. Not something we see very often. Sometimes what you need is in the main deck already.
And it's an Absorb. So this looks like insurance policy going into place now for Nassif.
I like it. I like it. 2 Revitalize, Moment of Craving, Absorb. Lock it up.
And you mentioned this. Look at this. 2 Lightning Strikes off the top of the library on the last couple of turns here for John. And that was one of the few ways that Nassif could conceivably lose this game. Make no mistake, he is way far ahead right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think John Rolf's plan is to hope maybe if he attacks with both, Nassif takes 3 and he can double Lightning Strike him, but I mean, not likely.
Right, there's a lot of problems with that plan, but right now John doesn't have the luxury of taking a better one. So he's just going to ship in there with his 2 creatures.
Yeah, this is really unfortunate for him because I mean he's got to know when his opponent just casts Mastermind's Acquisition out of his deck that he likely has something that's going to not allow him to be killed, to be burned out.
Yeah, this is one of the conundrums of high-level play, though, right? Because the fact that he did that actually makes him more likely to need to make a risky play like this, even though it feels like it makes you more likely that that play won't work.
Yeah. Nassif's going to go ahead and cast the Moment of Craving on the Growth Chamber Guardian, take no damage, and with that, John Rolf's had enough.
That is going to do it for game number 1. Yellowhat. Gabriel Nassif picks up game 1. And, you know, I want to touch back on what you hit on earlier, David. The matchups lined up perfectly here for Nassif. This is not only the matchups that he would have chosen, it's the exact order of matchups and play draw that he would have chosen as well.
Yeah, I mean, now there's something to say about playing first in the control mirror, because you get to play your lands first, to deploy your planeswalkers first, but Nassif's not playing planeswalkers. That extra card is huge. There's no real threat of your opponent jumping out in front of you. The planeswalker that he's worried about does cost 5, and he has absorbed, so I actually think being on the draw on the control mirror is not bad. It might even be preferred by Nassif here. Going to go ahead and study the list, but like I said, Team of Reclamation, the deck that it excels against is Esper Control. The deck that has trouble with, John just doesn't present. So even if he is able to win this match, the third game doesn't bode well for John either, because there's no real matchup he wants.
So the players are going to consult deck lists here. You can see that they've got the same sheets of paper that David and I have in front of us here as well. Just making sure that you go over everything, making sure that there's nothing that you missed, the little differences between people's lists. You know, for the most part, you know what's in a given list, but you know sometimes people will throw a spicy little one of in there.
Yeah, and I think one of the key cards here is going to be the Immortal Sun. I think Nassif with 3 Masterminds acquisition, once one of those is on the board, Teferi no longer functions. And the only answer for John Rolf is going to have to be his 1 Masterminds acquisition to find a spell that can destroy artifacts. He has an Invoke the Divine and a Cleansing Nova, and that's pretty much it. So it's going to be trouble for him if an Immortal Sun is on the board. All right. Players are asking, making sure who plays first. Here we go.
And it looks like we're underway here for game number 2. Will it be Yellowhat finishing off John Rolf in this match and moving on,
Very
or
solid hand for
will it be
John
John evening things up?
Sorry, very solid hand for John Rolf. Mana, that's key to these control matchups. Negate, and now 2 absorbs. Only 1 dead card, Kaya's Wrath. That's the key, is to not draw your dead cards. You don't want things like Cast Down and Moment of Craving in your opening hand.
What does a win look like for Nassif in this matchup?
Well, resolving a Wilderness Reclamation is step 1.
Okay.
Once you resolve one of those, it's going to be pretty hard for John to win unless he happens to have a Mortify, which he did just draw here. So,
okay.
So the matchup isn't really a great one for John, but he's drawn the cards he's needed to draw. I think right now he just wants to make sure he continues to hit his land drops so that he can play multiple spells a turn. He needs to get into a counter fight. And I think that's also what Nassif's looking for, because he's got 2 Sinister Sabotages in his hands, but like those Shivan's Fires, they don't really do much. So 2 dead cards, and now John draws Vraska's Contempt. So it's 2 dead cards to 2 dead cards. But Nassif has the Chemist's Insight, which is going to be huge.
And by the way, if you're relatively new to Magic, first off, welcome. We're glad to have you watching. Thanks so much for joining us. Also, control mirrors go like this a lot. You might be looking and saying, well, why are there no attacks happening? Why is there nothing on the battlefield? And this is actually how things tend to go for control.
Yeah, one of the biggest ways to lose a control mirror, though, is to miss land drops. And John Rolf just missed his 5th land drop. Now, obviously, you think, oh, 5th land, who cares? He's got 4. But in these control mirrors, one of the most common sequences of play you'll see is just land go, land go, land go for many turns. And the first guy to stop laying lands is usually the one that ends up being forced to make an action, because eventually they're going to have to discard and they have to do something, and then your opponent has lots of lands. They can play multiple spells a turn. Yeah,
it gets tough, because if you're the first one to act, that means that your opponent gets to react to you, and then on their turn they can cast whatever they want. And oftentimes there's really important cards to resolve in a matchup like this, and once resolved, well, things get ugly. Now, Nassif actually discarded here, but that was a little different because he actually fired off that Chemist's Insight.
Yeah, he was discarding the hand size because he just drew too many cards, and he's got plenty of dead cards. Fiery Cannonade is obviously 0 usage, so that card was discarded right away.
And you're saying that because Rolf has effectively no creatures in his deck.
No creatures that 2 damage matters to.
Yep.
Now he discards Shivan Fire to jumpstart the Chemist's Insight. He's just setting up. Niv Mizzet is a very powerful card here. He knows he can resolve it because it can't be countered, but his opponent likely has a removal spell. So I think he wants to get to a spot to where he maybe has 9 mana so he can protect it with one of these Sinister Sabotages. which he's well on his way to 9 mana, drawing all these cards, finding his lands.
Yeah, there's a temptation to just play a card like Niv Mizzet because, you know, hey, it can't be countered anyway. But generally speaking, if you know it will get removed at some point, it's worth it to set up a big fight where you can get a ton of value off of it and kind of make it a lose-lose situation for your opponent.
What's beautiful about it is if you're having a counter war over something
You're
while
just
Niv Mizzet is in
drawing
play,
cards.
your opponent is not only just taking a point of damage for every spell that's cast, but you're drawing cards for every spell that's cast. So you might lose the counter war, but you still won the war because now you've got your hand replenished.
Of course, the downside to waiting is that if your opponent finds a card like Thought Erasure, they can take it away and kind of force the issue, make you use your Sinister Sabotages to protect a card in hand.
Nassif very patient. He baited the search for Escanta. John Rolf cast Absorb, leaving 2 mana up, so he could cast Negate, but Nassif opted not to cast Sinister Sabotage. He didn't want to tap out. He wanted to leave some mana open. And John Rolf, again, without 6 lands, skipping another land drop, passing. And Nassif continues to make land drops, which is huge. And now we're at the point where John Rolf's going to have to discard a card, all because he's just missing land drops. Now, he does happen to have Chaos Wrath, which is fine to discard, but after this point, look at his hand. He wants to keep those Vraska's Contempts, at least have a shot against Niv Mizzet. Just in time. 6 mana, won't have to discard.
So both players staying very patient. Again, if you're just joining us here, yes, there's nothing on the battlefield outside of lands, and that is kind of what you expect in a matchup like this. But I'll tell you what, when the fireworks start, there will be a flurry of them, and at the end of it, somebody's going to be in a really good position to win, and somebody's not. This is a decider, by the way, meaning that the winner of this will advance out of this group.
Now with 7th mana, can play Search for Escanta with Absorb and Negate backup to ensure it resolves, and he's got enough cards in his graveyard, so the following turn it will flip. So now Nassif's put to a test. Does he want to Sinister Sabotage this? He knows his opponent's likely to have a counterspell back.
How big of a deal is Search for Escanta if you're sitting in the Nassif seat? Are you super worried about it?
Absolutely. Once, if that flips and your opponent's able to each turn search for a card, they're going to, a non-land card, they're going to be able to find more counterspells and more cards that you have to answer. They're no longer at the mercy of the top of their deck. I think we're going to see John fight over this at least with 1 counterspell. If he doesn't really have much else going on. Nope, looks like he's going to let it resolve. Just pass the turn, stay patient. Nassif decides to draw the opt. Got his 10th mana source here. He might be wanting to get to another counter so he can back up the Niv Mizzet, or a Wilderness Reclamation, so that if a Niv Mizzet gets countered, he can land a Wilderness Reclamation. But I think he's just going to cast opt here, but it might be time to pull the trigger. Here he goes.
He's kind of floating Niv Mizzet here.
Yeah, I mean, if he does play it, his opponent doesn't have enough mana for removal plus counter. He can't counter the Niv Mizzet, so here we go. Now, if his opponent goes for Vraska's Contempt, Nassif can counter. Luckily for Johnny, he has 2 Vraska's Contempt, so he can untap and cast another in the main phase. But again,
disaster.
He's going to draw a whole lot of cards from the ability of Niv Mizzet.
So here we go. Vraska's Contempt now from John Rolf is going to trigger Niv Mizzet. You get to draw a card. Whenever you draw a card, you get to do 1 damage. Damage probably not going to be super relevant here, but those cards most certainly are.
And it triggers for each player. So when Nassif casts his own counterspell, he's going to draw another card and do a damage. And if next turn John Rolf wants to Vraska's Contempt, that's another card and a damage. So the Niv Mizzet
proves super annoying for these control decks.
And this is amazing. He actually has mana open, so he can opt. Which will trigger the Niv Mizzet again and get another card. So even though we know Niv Mizzet's going to be removed, just the amount of cards taken out of John Rolf's hand and the amount of card advantage Yellowhat has drawn from the Niv Mizzet is just incredible.
It's going to make it very, very difficult for John Rolf to come back from a card deficit of this order. He's considering using Mortify or Vraska's Contempt. Interesting choice here, because either of them are going to take care of Niv Mizzet, but they have 2 different options. Basically, do you want to be able to kill a Planeswalker going forward or an enchantment?
Yeah, I actually think I would use Vraska's Contempt here, because Vraska's Contempt can only take care of Niv Mizzet in this deck, whereas Mortify can deal with a Wilderness Reclamation. So like right now, he just used Mortify, right? And Granted, he has counterspell mana, but he can only cast one. Let's say Nassif untaps, plays Wilderness Reclamation with one counter backup, and lands it. He's got no way to get it off the board. So I'm curious as to why he chose this method, this card over it, because he's 4 mana versus 3 mana. He can still only cast one counterspell. Okay, that's why.
Yeah, so he wanted to keep up negate and absorb for the next turn.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's the line he took. But as we mentioned, Niv Mizzet Perun finally encouraged to leave the battlefield there by John Rolf, but the damage is done. Look at that hand from Yellowhat. He has got a full grip, and he's going to be cruising through this hand as well with cards like Search for Azcanta and Growth Spiral at the ready, though. He does have a lot of lands.
Yeah, and we're going to see probably 2 counterspells from John Rolf here for each of these enchantments Nassif has, which are both backbreaking. Wilderness Reclamation would just give Nassif such a mana advantage.
Nassif would love to see a little bit more card draw here. I'm surprised I'm saying that, given how many extra cards he's drawn this game, but a little extra wouldn't hurt.
He's a little flooded. I mean, he's got 3 more lands in hand, and he drew 2 more of his dead cards. Wow, Wilderness Reclamation survives.
All right.
I guess John figures with 3 counterspells he can counter any expansion explosion, but now this has got to get countered, because if it does flip with Wilderness Reclamation out, he gets to activate it twice a turn.
That's right, you can activate it on your main phase, and then untap all your lands and activate it again. And that's a card advantage engine that John Rolf can simply not keep up with at this point. All he has are reactive spells in his hand. Absorb, Negate, and Nevraska's Contempt. But the good news for John, there's a thought erasure, though. I think
it's not going to get anything.
I think Nassif is like, good.
It's not going to get anything relevant, but at least John Rolf now will know and feel comfortable that he doesn't have anything to worry about, and he gets that Surveil trigger. There's no Banefire in Nassif's list. Something that might be interesting with all this mana.
A little extra value there for John as well. The Surveil is going to put Cry of the Carnarium in the graveyard from the top of his library. He certainly doesn't want to draw that in this matchup. There's an opt, though, for Nassif. Dig.
Still got to work through 2 counters. And the only spells that are really relevant right here that John Rolf has to worry about, both Search for Azcantas are in the graveyard. There's 1 Niv Mizzet left and 4 Expansion Explosions. And that's pretty much all he has to worry about. So he's got 2 counters for 2 of the 4 Expansion Explosions.
This is one of those weird control mirrors where when you look at the other side, you kind of go, well, what are the cards that I really care about, and how many counters do I have to counter them? And sometimes it's like, I have more counters than you have cards that I care about.
If you think about it, there's 1 Niv Mizzet left, which he's got Vraska's Contempt for. There are 4 Expansion Explosions. He's got 2 counter spells. After that, that's it. The other 2 Expansion Explosions are the only way Yellowhat has to win this game. So if John Rolf were, say, to find a couple more counter spells and Nassif not find a Sinister Sabotager, which 2 are already in the graveyard, he won't be able to win.
Nassif just made a mistake. I don't know what it was, though. I just saw him put his hand on his head like, oh, what am I doing?
Yeah, and it looks like it won't matter, though, because John has so many counter spells.
Isn't Nassif going for the explosion?
Yeah, he's floating that mana. I mean, you should float the mana anyways, just to get your opponent to always have that fear and not cast like a Chemister's Insight in their end step. So you should always usually float that mana, whether you're going to do it or not, so your opponent has to worry.
But as we know, even though this normally would be a pretty exciting play, an explosion for $1 million, it's not going to resolve here.
Yeah, pretty unlucky for Nassif that John's hand is lined up perfectly against what he's trying to do.
And there it is, absorb.
Nassif's going to need John to draw nothing for a few turns and draw 3 straight threats or 2 straight explosion expansions.
Wow, look at this. Chemister's Insight was a draw step there for John Rolf, fueling his hand now. Things starting to shape up here for John. All right, he finds a land and a blank. Moment of Gravy not going to do anything in this matchup.
Well, it can be discarded to Chemister's Insight. Allows him to play this land and still keep his other 2 cards.
The upside to blanks.
Yeah, Chemister's Insight is actually very important in Best of 1 for that reason. You can run a lot of situational cards, and then when you find matchups where they're not good, you can discard them to Jumpstart. So Jumpstart's really, really big for Best of 1.
Land go from Nassif.
I honestly believe Nassif's going to run out of threats. Unless the draw phases work out perfectly for him, I don't see him being able to win this.
Another blank off the top. Well, maybe not a blank. Kaisrath at least can get rid of Niv-Mizzet.
Yeah, but when you've got Vraska's Contempt and there's no other target, I mean, you might want to keep 2 in case it gets countered, though. But in this spot, discarding it was just the best play.
Another Wilderness Reclamation to draw here for Gabriel Nassif. They do stack up. He's got a lot of mana available to him now, but it's not really what he needed.
Yeah, he's got more than a lethal amount of mana if he were to find an expansion explosion, and want to do it for 20. He's got plenty. But this is what he needs. He needs John Rolf to draw some dead cards. Now this one's going to get the last negate out of his hand, and then he's going to have 2 left or Niv-Mizzet. We both know Niv-Mizzet will get contempted, so he's pretty much got to cast this and he's got 2 outs. He could wait, try to draw Sinister Sabotage. There's still 2 left in his deck, and try to have some backup for it. Or he could go for it now. I think he's worried with his opponent having 4 cards. He knows there's likely a counter, but he might just go for it because sometimes when you wait and give them, and you worry about a card, you just give your opponent time to draw it.
Nassif, of course, taking a look at the graveyards as well. If your opponent is something common to see at this stage of a game, to understand, since they have the deck list, well, how many copies of a card that I'm worried about here do they have left in the library? And that will inform your decision here in a big way.
I like it. Speaking of sleeves, John Rolf using the Gruul sleeves, playing Esper Control. I like that. Oh, no. Well, it is an instant. Nassif will be able to cast it. It won't be a lethal one, but the card draw is pretty lethal, so I think John Rolf's still going to have to negate this expansion explosion, even though it's not lethal. Although, what's pretty interesting is, say, if you let it resolve and it's not lethal, and he does draw, there's only 2 more expansion explosions, so unless he draws both, you could actually just take it with this thought erasure, and then you have negate for the other one. So it's actually kind of a heads-up play. You might want to let this resolve.
Yeah, I'd be checking to see how many cards in library. And look at that. That's exactly what he did. It was 26 cards left. He thinks, oh, there's a couple of more in there.
So let's see how many land does Nassif have in play. It's for 12. If you don't negate this, think about this. You don't negate this, right? He draws 12 cards. There are only 3 relevant cards in his deck, besides the counter spells. Your Thought Erasure can take 1. You've got Vraska's Contempt for the Niv-Mizzet, and the negate he just used, you could use for the other Explosion expansion. So the only way that bites you is if he gets 2 threats plus a counter spell, of which there's 2 left also. It might have actually been a heads-up play to let that resolve. I mean, it's risky. And look, there was a Sinister Sabotage in the top card of his deck, so that would have been one of the 12. So maybe you just go ahead and get rid of it, but...
This was definitely the safer play here from John Rolf, but we'll see if it ends up panning out for him. This has been an interesting control mirror here between these 2 players.
But it might have actually, I think, now that I think about it, I think you actually let that resolve.
There's another negate now, though, for Rolf.
Knowing what threats he has left in his deck.
Yeah. Super interesting. And there it is, Chemist's Insight finally going to fuel the fire here for Gabriel Nassif. Not a great target for negate either. If you're sitting in John Rolf's seat, you're not stoked about burning your negate here on this, so he's just going to let it happen. And then he draws into another one plus a 3rd copy of Wilderness Reclamation. He's going to be making a lot of mana. But he can afford to just go ahead and fire off Chemist's Insight number 2 for the turn. And Rolf is like, yeah, I mean, there's not that many cards I care about. And you can see that. He keeps drawing Shivan Fires and lands, cards that John doesn't care about at all.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with this is he's only got 1 counter now. This is why I go back to thinking about maybe letting that resolve. I mean, it's very counterintuitive, but with deck list in hand, knowing what you're worried about, you got to think how this game plays out. By expending all his resources there, now he's back to just 1-for-1ing with Nassif. And something like Chemist's Insights right now is going to allow him to find an answer with Sabotage backup unless John can find a counterspell.
And there it is, triple Wilderness Reclamation, but nothing really doing with it at the moment.
Well, these Shivan Fires are good fuel for Jumpstart, and he's throwing a lot of cards. All he has to do is find one with counter backup, and luckily for him, John only has 1 counter spell.
Yeah, he's already got the Sinister Sabotage, so he's halfway home, is Gabriel Nassif. And there's Niv-Mizzet Perun. But as we mentioned before, John Rolf has been kind of waiting for that one. He's got the Vraska's Contempt at the ready.
He does. And I think actually Nassif, it would be better for him to not waste a counter protecting it, because if John Rolf has multiple removal spells and then you waste all your counters protecting it and it gets removed, then you're going to, again, have no counter to protect your explosion expansion. I mean, this is a really tricky situation, managing your threats. But
look at this. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria was the draw step now for John Rolf. Is Nassif forced to fight over this?
It's tough. I mean, it is a way to get rid of Niv Mizzet without using a card that he can draw. You can just tuck it. So unless your opponent's able to kind of deal 5 damage with the Niv Mizzet before you pass the turn back, they can get rid of it. But I think he really needs to hold those counter spells to protect his explosion expansion, because that's the only way he's got to win. I mean, I think that's just what he's got to go for. And
oh, and there it is. Expansion Explosion off the top of the library. He's going to go for Niv Mizzet first.
Yeah, with 3 Wilderness Reclamations, he's going to get 3 triggers to untap all these lands. Let's just say he's got 100 mana. Might as well cast a Niv Mizzet first, maybe get some cards out of your opponent's hands.
All right, this is a
for the win.
Big turn here for Gabriel Nassif, and this is going to be the one potentially that ends this game. Remember, Nassif won game number 1. If he can find a way here on his end step with triple Wilderness Reclamation and 100 lands on the battlefield to finish off Rolf, we're done here, and that is Nassif out of his group and into the 4 that will advance.
Yeah, now he needs to count his deck and make sure if he doesn't have 20 cards, because if he targets himself with the card draw, then he's going to deck out. So you have to also target your opponent if you have less than 20 cards.
Growth Spiral now for Nassif. And this damage is going to add up as well. He's using this to manage Teferi at the moment.
Yeah, every time he draws a card and casts a spell, so anything that draws a card that is a spell does 2 damage effectively. So he's going ahead and start taking out the Teferi so that when they do have the counter war over the expansion explosion, he can also finish the Teferi.
Again, backup plans for your backup plans. Gabriel Nassif knows every angle.
Yeah, Nassif is a control master, they say. I mean, he's got so much experience playing these kind of decks as long as I've known him. So I don't think we're going to see any missteps here. But he is known to, he's human. We all make mistakes, but I don't think we're going to see any here in this spot.
Okay, here we go. 3 triggers from Wilderness Reclamation. Each of them will untap all of Nassif's lands.
And he found a Syncopate. So he's got another counterspell here with all that mana.
This is very much just a counting game at this point for Nassif. He just needs to make sure that he can sink everything else into Syncopate while still leaving up Sinister Sabotage, but also still getting lethal here with this explosion.
Yeah, I mean, he's got 19 lands, it looks like. 4, 6, 10, 16, 19, with 3 triggers of untapping coming.
What?
So that's...
I mean, he did use a good amount of mana on his first one, but still.
He's still got 57 mana available from the untaps. From plus 10 in his pool, he's going to have 67 mana available.
What in the world?
So John Rolf's going to start a fight now before those triggers untap at least, but...
what is he going to fight over? Niv Mizzet, I think.
Well, no, it's over the removal spell. He's going to go ahead and target it now before all the mana, untaps. But
I am just saying he's
doesn't
going to
really
fire
do
off the
much,
removal spell, and I think that Nassif will be like, sure, you did it. So John's going to target Niv Mizzet Perun with Vraska's Contempt. That's another trigger for Niv Mizzet, another card, another point of damage.
Oh, and the second expansion explosion. So Nassif's got to feel like he's really doing it.
Back up for his backup. Things looking good for Yellowhat here in game number 2.
You can just let that resolve with 2 counters and 2 Fireball you and draw your decks.
He's actually talking to John Rolf right now saying, I have all the things that I need, but Nassif, you do need to tap and untap and tap and untap.
It's like, listen, buddy, come over here and look at my screen. Don't make me do this.
Don't make me do this, please. If I misclick, I'll never forgive myself.
Yeah.
He won't, though. This is going to be just fine. And it's a lot of clicking, admittedly, when you have triple Wilderness Reclamation and 19 lands on the battlefield, but this is the route to victory now for Gabriel Nassif as he's going through the motions. Tap, 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 tap. And then he'll let a Wilderness Reclamation trigger resolve. That'll untap everything and then do it all over again and then do it one more time.
Here we go.
That was one of them. This is the last one on the stack.
Be careful that when he selects the expansion explosion, he either puts it in full control and selects exactly what mana to use and doesn't let it use up all his blue and red and leave him with 16 green mana in his mana pool. But what you can do is you can leave on the last untap, leave those lands untapped and use them as you need to use them.
Pretty
right
insane, too. With the amount of mana he has, he could just have 2 lethal expansion explosions here.
So right now, he doesn't have to tap the lands in play. He's still got 20, 30, 48 mana.
Here it is.
Cast
The
your
first of potentially 2 lethal expansion explosions. He should only need the first one. Looking at the hand, though, just negate in hand here for John Rolf. He can fire that off. That'll get countered, and that should be
We
the
just got to
match.
make sure, don't mess up. Target your opponent with both targets.
Oh, yeah.
You don't want to draw your deck here because you would actually lose and the game would be a draw.
Indeed. John Rolf in the unenviable position of having to just sort of wait for his opponent to make sure that the mechanics and everything work correctly for him to win the game. But Gabriel Nassif now on the stack, X equals 30
And they're both at
for
you.
explosion. And both indeed are targeting John Rolf. And all he can do is fire off and negate. And there it is, Sinister Sabotage from Gabriel Nassif. It's going to prompt the concession, and Nassif is through. He has survived the group of death, and he's our first player to emerge as one of the 4 that will leave this incredible group behind. Boy, what an accomplishment for Gabriel Nassif. Congratulations to Yellowhat for advancing past Group C.
He might only be a challenger, but he is a Hall of Famer. He is one of the best of all time, and as we saw, he is a control master.
Yeah, that's right. Welcome back here. Thanks so much for coming in for coverage of the Mythic Invitational powered by Owen by HP. That's David Williams and Marshall Sutcliffe, and we're on the floor here of PAX East. A whole lot of people rolling in and checking it out. We've got a very large screen above us of all the action that we're commentating on, and we're so happy to have you along to watch this fantastic event. 64 players entered. Right now, we're cutting away a whole bunch of them, though. Yesterday, we went from 32 to 8. We're going to do the same thing today for groups C and D. And by the way, we've got one right now, and that is Gabriel Nassif.
Top 9.
Yeah.
Got our top 9. And what about the other match of 2 MPL players battling for a spot?
I don't see him over there anymore, so I don't know, man. You know what I know. I got the same screen, so hopefully we'll be getting updates on that, though, as we work our way through. We've had some really sweet matchups here down the stretch, and it kind of had to be that way as well. And, yeah, it looks like Seth Manfield. Yeah,
Seth Manfield takes it.
He's going to be through, sending Sigris down to the lower bracket, but he's still alive.
So from yesterday, we have 1 MPL and 1 challenger added to the 8 from yesterday, which brings it to 4 MPLs, 3 invited challengers, and 2 of the
qualifiers.
I guess 4-4. 4-4-2. That's our composition of the top 10.
Maybe the MPL will strike back today, only putting in.
I predicted a big day for the MPL today.
Yeah, it does seem like that's going to be the case here as well, especially again when you look at the level of talent that we have here in the feature match area. We've got Becca down with an interview right now.